Why are restraints harmful? Prone and supine restraints constrict air passages and may cause death under certain circumstances. When should these restraints be used? Guidance from the Office for Civil Rights emphasizes the use of restraints only as an emergency measure to address imminent threats of harm to a student or others, and not a routine behavior management technique. The OCR explicitly warns against using any restraints that restrict breathing because they can cause serious injury or death. Why has the use of restraints been a long-standing and pervasive issue? State restraint statutes and regulations vary across the United States. There is no federal legislation establishing minimum restraint safety standards and definitions for schools to prevent and reduce inappropriate use. In 2009, the OCR began requiring districts to report restraint numbers through the annual Civil Rights Data Collection Database. This report, released by Disability Rights Texas, examines data reported by the Texas Education Agency for the 2018-2019 school year. Key report findings. Students with disabilities represent approximately 9.8% of the state's school population, but they experience 91% of the restraints in Texas's public schools. Students with disabilities that often experience challenging behaviors as part of their profile were among the highest reports of restraint. Students with disabilities who are served in separate behavior classrooms and campuses often have undertrained staff. This results in an over-reliance on improper restraints as a disciplinary practice. Black or African American students make up 15.8% of students with disabilities in Texas. However, they make up 26.5% of all restraints of students with disabilities in our public schools. In some school districts, that disproportionality is even greater.
So I do think we have to think about the kinds of schools we want to have, the kinds of professionals who have the expertise to respond to emergency situations. And I will tell you that I believe the quality special educators have tools that they know that need to be taught to other systems, but all too frequently it's happening the other way, that we're hardening our schools, we're pushing more law enforcement mentality into our schools, and sometimes even when educators are trying to do all the right things, those unintended consequences of kind of the criminalization of minor misbehavior are taking root.
The report describes that there is underreporting of rates of restraints across districts. Only 478 of 1,200 LEAs reported these data, which means rates are likely much higher than the data included in the report. What is contributing to the underreporting, and how might the state foster accountability to ensure more reliable reporting?
Our current practices in Texas, the Texas Education Agency receives the data, but there's no data verification where they go back to districts that are reporting no or very few restraints per student. I think we can acknowledge that Texas has a lot of very small districts, and so it's theoretically possible that there's some very small district that had no restraints in a particular year. But also, as the report highlights, some very large districts that had reported no restraints. And the reason we know that data verification works is that a few years back, when the GAO reported that 4 different Texas large districts had reported very, very few restraints, 3 of those 4 course corrected, trained their staff in restraint reporting, and the numbers have come up appropriately. And only Houston ISD continues to be an outlier there among those that have been highlighted by the GAO a few years ago and are still struggling with getting their act together on reporting.
We were surprised by the distribution of restraint used by school resource officers, SROs. Just under 13% of reported restraints by SROs, and the rest were by school staff. Do you think these data accurately reflect practices being used by SROs? Are there other reporting issues when an SRO becomes involved that leads to a restraint not being reported in the school data?
the SROs and school police are so different by district in our state. Some work directly for the district, some have their own police forces, some are true police, some are SROs, some are security guards. I absolutely think that kind of depending on the setup and the training and who's doing this training, that there are reporting issues in some districts. I will also point out, though, that when we look at the distribution of children in schools, many grade levels are at the elementary level, and that is the level that we have fewer SROs in. And so in most districts, SROs that cover elementary school campuses are shared between a number of campuses or kind of on an on-call basis instead of having an SRO per elementary school like you would at the middle and high school level. And so practically there are going to be situations that arise where, especially at the elementary level, where you're going to have more direct school staff involvement and less SRO involvement, which I do believe is a good thing. We don't want to encourage SRO involvement at the elementary school level.
Thinking about the preschool to prison pipeline, how might findings from this report and others related to disproportionality in use of restraint or other harmful disciplinary practices contribute to this pipeline?
I always think in behavior about how important appropriate modeling is. And what we find in our report is that time and time again, what the video evidence shows us is that we see restraints where the school staff were the first to initiate the physical part of the confrontation. You have a non-compliant child, a child who's refusing a verbal command, a child who's not going where you tell them to go, but then the staff become agitated and initiate the physicality. We're teaching behavior when we do that. We're not only creating a potentially unsafe situation in that instance, we're teaching a child to become more violent, with our own poor example when that happens. And so to me, when we think about the costs that are going to happen going forward when we don't appropriately address behavior, when that behavior escalates, the exclusionary discipline, the law enforcement referral of the future, there are real consequences. I also think it's important for people to begin to think about restraint data as one more data point in how they look at school to prison issues and how they look at school culture and climate regarding behavior and discipline. The data in many ways are similar to what we see, the disproportionalities and exclusionary discipline and law enforcement referral, but this is another valuable data point, and it's one that's not being targeted enough in reform efforts and in monitoring school improvement.
How do we see disproportionality in school discipline either being replicated or contributing to broader policing practices in our society for individuals with disabilities and Black individuals?
Schools are in a unique position to get to work with people younger than other systems. And so one of the best things about getting to work in education or aligned professions is you try to have a preventative impact. And we know, especially when young children misbehave, that they're trying to communicate something with us, to us. And when we don't listen to that message and respond with preventative, appropriate services that that child needs, we set them up for deepening involvement in a pipeline of all sorts. The pipeline in Texas in particular has been so researched and studied, probably more than any other state. We know the impact of exclusionary discipline on later criminal justice referral, even for similar behaviors, thanks to, the great work of the Breaking School Rules report a number of years ago. And so, I think it all comes back to taking that opportunity that educators and schools have to provide those preventative services, redirect those early signs of misbehavior, give kids the support they need, and prevent as much as possible entering into a school to prison pipeline or deepening involvement in a school to prison pipeline.
What is the most urgent call to action based on the findings of this report?
Statewide level, I think the most urgent call to action is we need accurate reporting. We need our Texas Education Agency to make sure that districts report data accurately, and then we need to do something with it. We need to look at our results-driven accountability manual, and we need to look at, should there be a rate of restraints that subjects a district to having to come up with a corrective action plan to address it? And so at the state level, I think that's the most important thing that needs to happen. I also think that when we think about very dangerous restraints, prone and supine restraints, floor restraints, that we need to think, do we need a ban in Texas on prone and supine restraints? And, people sometimes think about situations where a child might be a danger to themselves even on the floor, but no reputable restraint training company teaches people to take students to the ground. And yet in video after video, I witness untrained, undertrained teachers or paraprofessionals or others take kids down to the ground in a dangerous way. And so I think we also need to look at whether we need to clearly prohibit prone and supine restraint. I also think we need to re-examine what is a serious enough conduct that allows restraint in the first place. Texas was an early leader in having some restraint law, so I appreciate that about our state, but we still allow restraint for property damage as well as personal injury. And with the danger that restraint poses and with how counterproductive restraint is for a child's behavior, their feelings of safety, the potential trauma that it causes, do we really want to allow restraint only for property damage, or should it really be limited just to injury of self or others?
What is critical for school administrators and leaders to know?
I think one thing to know is that school administrators and leaders, you don't have to race to the bottom of the state standards. You can choose to look at your own data and your own kind of self-improvement. And so, in Texas, we don't have a requirement that all special educators have to be trained in prevention and in safe restraint when prevention's not possible. But you as a district administrator can choose that on your campus or in your district, all special educators are going to be trained, or that all school administrators are going to be trained. One of our clients this last year who had his arm broken was restrained by an untrained paraprofessional who worked a special education bus taking students to a behavioral campus. And the district, it had never occurred to them to train an individual taking students to a behavioral campus on de-escalation and restraint. And so he ends up breaking a child's arm. Even though we got better services in place for that child, the district still resisted our efforts to try to get them to agree to train all the paraprofessionals on special education buses on prevention and restraint. Those are choices that schools make, and they make them differently. There are districts that train a much broader group of individuals, and there are districts who train the bare minimum. So look at how you are training staff, especially on de-escalation, and the amount of people who should be trained in de-escalation should be high, in my view, and that's a key thing that administrators can do.
What is important for current and future educators to know?
I think that we can all recognize that any of these situations that come up are stressful for everyone involved, and that we all bring our baggage to our job. And so kids aren't the only ones that can have fight or flight responses to stressful situations, that can be overwhelmed by situations. And so, learn good self-care now. Get yourself the trauma-informed care that you need. To show up in the class to be the best version of yourself you can be for your students. And then also recognize when you're in a place where you don't have enough training, you don't have enough support to be able to educate a child and keep them safe. And don't be afraid from speaking that truth up the chain as necessary for your own protection and for that child's protection.
The report offers the following recommendations for reform in Texas. Ban prone and supine restraints. Remove regulatory allowance for restraint for property damage. Require ongoing competency-based de-escalation training for all school personnel who interact with students. Expand state data validation to ensure proper restraint reporting by local educational agencies. Incorporate a new monitoring indicator in the results-driven accountability system to identify local educational agencies that overuse restraint against all students or disproportionately restrain certain groups of students, and require that these schools develop corrective action plans.
Other important recommendations. Ensure all educators receive training in function-based thinking as a preventative strategy for undesired behaviors. Ensure all educators receive training on the acting out cycle. For example, calm, trigger, agitation, acceleration, peak, de-escalation, and recovery as a preventative strategy for undesired behaviors. Ensure all educators receive ongoing professional learning related to the characteristics of students with disabilities. Ensure all educators receive ongoing professional learning on positive and preventative evidence-based classroom and behavior management strategies.